Hi everyone, and welcome back or welcome to my channel if you have been here before. If you haven't, please subscribe to the bilingual family of people that are just rambling and trying to speak English, but it's not working. I actually tried to film a video before this and it worked, but whilst I was waiting for this battery to charge, I was editing the other video and well, it's a whole lot of rambling. A few things before we start. If you're wondering, yes, I have shot another video before this one, so if you want to see how I make this look, this by the way is my no foundation routine, so I am not wearing foundation. So if you want to see that, I will link it down below or somewhere up in these corners, I don't know which one. Secondly, yes, I did move that plant on top of my table just so I can have a nice background. Normally it's on the floor where I'm sitting. I had to change it up a little, you know. I am currently living in a dorm. There's only so much I can do. Third and final thing, yes, this video is 5 eyeshadow palettes for beginners. So beginner friendly eyeshadow palettes. I went through my collection and I was like, if I was a beginner, which 5 palettes would be ideal for me? I always have like my little paper and I write like video ideas and then the products that I'm gonna use. Where is it? It's on the back. Okay. When I was thinking of this particular video, I was like, which 5 eyeshadow palettes do I want and what type of eyeshadow palettes? So I looked at my collection basically and I was like, okay, we have to have blendability. Usually when you're a beginner, you want the blendability of shadows to be very good or even seamless, because certain eyeshadow palettes, like Subculture, are a little bit tricky to work with if you are not familiar with eyeshadow palettes or just eyeshadow formulas in general and the differences between certain eyeshadow formulas. So I was like, okay, they have to blend really easy and very friendly, and you know, eyeshadow has to be friendly apparently. The second one is I wanted the pigmentation to be buildable. I didn't want intense pigment at once. I didn't want the pigmentation to be so intense that you put one dot on your eye and then you spend 5 years trying to blend it out and it's just all over your brow. So I wanted pigmentation that was buildable but also not too sheer or just not pigmented enough that you had to build up layer after layer after layer after layer. And then I also have easy and fuss free, which kind of ties in with the pigmentation and the blendability of eyeshadow formulas. And then the last thing that I wrote down, the last thing that I tried to write, I think, is you see, bilingual. It's a mess. Anyway, so the last thing that I wrote down is a different color scheme. So I have different type of color schemes with each palette. So we have neutral, basic, a mix of basic and neutral. I mean a mix of neutral and colorful. Then we have a monochromatic palette, a pastel-y kind of palette, and a full-on color palette. So yeah, I have 5 eyeshadow palettes that are all of those things combined, except for the color schemes. Those are different. Especially with the color schemes, I just wanted to make sure that if you are a beginner and you're thinking of picking up certain palettes, that these 5 palettes kind of will do at first, because the color scheme is so different from each other. So all of your palettes will be quite versatile or have a certain look that you want to go for, but you can also use them together, you know. First eyeshadow palette that I want to talk about is obviously a neutral kind of palette, and it's actually the palette that I used to create this look in a previous video. I feel like this is a really cult classic, and every single person that has this is kind of like, oh yeah, I have that palette and every time I do a look with it, it's beautiful. So it's the Soft Glam palette by Anastasia Beverly Hills. First of all, I kind of love this mustardy color. I think it's such a beautiful color. What really matters obviously is the inside, and this to me, look at this. I am personally not the biggest fan of wearing neutrals. I don't really wear eyeshadow on a everyday basis because that's a little bit frowned upon in Belgium. But whenever I have like one of my neutral type of days, which is for example one that I have right now, I do gravitate towards this palette because it has all of the neutrals that I personally really enjoy. It has just the color scheme of it is really nice. You know, you have your really soft transition colors like orange soda and burnt orange. You have a few browns that have a different depth, so they have a different undertone and a different depth. For example, sienna is very red, rustic isn't the deepest brown, and it's more like a caramelly brown. And then you have cypress umber, which is a really beautiful deep brown. And then if you want to smoke things up even more, you have a noir, which is the black shade in the palette. So in terms of a color scheme, this is like your perfect neutral palette in my opinion. I feel like this palette with the color scheme and especially the formula, this palette is ideal for a beginner and also really perfect for somebody that has a little bit more experience with eyeshadow. But for beginners, this is a very beginner friendly formula. The mattes in here are really nice, blend very easily. They do have quite a bit of pigment to them, so you only want to dip in a few times, tap off the excess and then apply them to the eyes. But even then, if you apply a little bit too much, you can still blend it away, and it's not like the color fades or it's impossible to blend, but it just blends out really nicely and doesn't go all over the place. These shadows are very soft, which is something that I also really like. The shimmers in here aren't the most impactful, they're not really metallic. Having said that, they are really suited for somebody who is a beginner and who would like to play with shimmers that are a little bit more mature in that way, because I find that metallic shimmers often turn very chunky on the eyes, and even though they have quite a bit of impact, they look chunky and they just don't look right. So overall, I think this palette is really fuss free. It's just really easy to it's just a really easy to work with palette, and I absolutely recommend this if you are a beginner at eyeshadow and you are looking for a neutral palette. This just blends by itself really. So the next palette I want to talk about is basically a mix of neutral and pops of color. I wanted to put a palette like this in this video because I think neutral palettes are lovely, entirely colorful palettes are lovely, but sometimes you want to have like a little bit of a mix to like zhuzh it up a little bit, and you want certain pop of colors that aren't too intense or not too demanding. So for this kind of mix in between kind of palette, I decided to go with the Nabla Secret palette. This is absolutely one of my favorite palettes when it comes to that mix between neutral but also kind of colorful. First of all, I really enjoy the packaging. I think it's so pretty. And then when you go on the inside, you have this beautiful palette. Now on camera, it always looks a little bit muted. In real life, these colors are very rich in terms of color, but not necessarily in terms of pigmentation. The pigmentation is very buildable with each shade. You don't want to be a little bit careful with No Black, which is a black shade in this palette, because that shade is quite intense, to be honest. But I like this palette first of all because of the color scheme. So it's a real mix between these kind of neutral shades that are slightly more pinky, but you also have like your typical brownie shades. Then you have like these fun pops of color that are just very beginner friendly in the terms that they will guide you towards really working with full-on color. But if you're a little bit scared to use some color, I think this palette is excellent because you have some really cool shimmers, like Play Hard is one of my favorites. Oh, I'm still filming. I was afraid I wasn't filming. Also in terms of the formula, this formula is absolutely beautiful. Again, it blends very easily, very seamlessly as well. And the shimmers are one of a kind. I love them. I have a few different types of shimmers in this, so it's also again a great introduction to more opaque and more impactful shimmers. You have certain shimmers like I Promise and Romeo, which are basically the same kind of shimmer as the Anastasia one, so they are a little bit more mature. They're not as impactful. It's more like a sheen of like a luminosity or glow and a little bit of color onto the eyes. But then you also have shades like Hyper Sensual and Play Hard, this one right here, which are a little bit grittier and are more like an eyeshadow topper. And because they are an eyeshadow topper, they just look very multi-dimensional and they're just really fun to play with. The next category that I kind of want to show you a beginner-friendly palette is obviously the monochromatic palettes. Throughout the last year or the last 2 years, a lot of monochromatics palettes have come out on the market. I'm thinking about the ColourPop monochromatic situation, but also like a few high-end brands have come out with monochromatic palettes. It's just, monochromatic is just very easy because you have different tones of the same color family. It's really easy to play with, but it also looks really cool on the eyes to have like it's a moment, you know, it's a moment. I kind of wanted to talk about the ColourPop monochromatic palettes at first, but then I was like, I actually have monochromatic palettes in my collection that I prefer more, and they are actually really cheap, so I don't really have one monochromatic palette to talk about, so you kind of want to choose your own color, you know. The palettes that I want to talk about are the e.l.f. Bite-Size Eyeshadow palettes, and I have 3 of them. So these are the 3 that I have. So I have a pinky one, a greeny one, and then a blue one. These eyeshadow palettes are, first of all, very affordable. I think they're only like $4, which is like €4 even. So they're very, very affordable. And besides that, the formula on these is absolutely insane for the price. I would even go as far as to say that they're almost at par with the ABH and the Nabla ones. The shimmers inside of this are actually surprisingly also quite impactful, but they don't feel chunky or heavy on the lid, which is also a really nice bonus. I personally really like this quad. I have played with it before on my channel, and I actually absolutely adore the look that I came up with. I thought it was so pretty. The other 2 are also really nice. The pigmentation is buildable, but it's definitely not sheer at all, and I actually like the blendability of these so much. I think that's the thing I'm blown away by the most, and is the blendability of these guys. They blend so effortlessly, it's insane. It's like you put the shadow on your eye, you poof, 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 buff, done. I wish I was kidding, but I'm not. These are absolutely beautiful. So if you're looking for more of a monochromatic type of situation and you want something affordable, I would definitely go for the e.l.f. Bite-Size Eyeshadow palettes. The second to last category is obviously pastels, and I think one of my favorite palettes in terms of like the majority of them being pastels is the Sugarpill Fun Size Mini Color Palette. First of all, it has a cat on the packaging, but also the inside is absolutely gorgeous in my opinion. It has quite a bit of pastel shades, especially like this row is almost completely pastel, as well as this shade right here. Each and every one of these shades can be a pastel if you really wanted to, or it can be a very bright eyeshadow if you wanted to. Even though this palette is a little bit like small and you only have 9 shadows, the palette is still quite versatile in my opinion. There's a lot that you can do with this palette. I have done a lot with this palette, and it's also a nice complementary palette to other palettes that you want to use together, for example. The formula is really nice. These are all matte, so there are no shimmers inside of this palette. The shadows inside of this palette blend very easily. They blend very well. They have very nice pigmentation. Some of them have to be built up, but that's always the case if you are working with pastel palettes. It's never going to be like a one dab full pigmentation and full opaqueness. I feel like if you don't want to completely go in with a full-on color palette like the one I'm going to show you next, then I would kind of like dabble into this palette and maybe see how the shadows work, how colors work, how they blend together. But overall, this is a really nice palette, and I think it's really cute as well, so that's always a bonus. So if you want to move on with a more colorful palette, like not really a mix but also not really just like full-on bam in your face pigment, then I would definitely recommend this palette. Okay, so the final palette that I want to talk about is obviously the full-on color palette that I was talking about. Color eyeshadow palettes, you don't want them to be bland, you don't want the colors to be muted. You kind of want them, if you're using color, you want there to be color, you know. Having said that though, colors are extremely difficult to work with, especially bright ones. Because sometimes they are just a little bit too pigmented and they don't blend very well. So the palette that I want to recommend to you if you are a beginner and if you want a kind of versatile palette is the Bperfect Carnival XL Pro palette. I don't know if I can show you this to you completely. So this is a collaboration with Staceymariemua. They also have Tahiti Love, I think, or Love Tahiti, which is basically the third palette with Staceymarie. And then this is the inside. So as you can see, this is basically a paint palette with every single color that you can possibly imagine. Not necessarily imagine, but need if you are a beginner. The entire rainbow is in this palette, as to say. And the reason that I haven't really bought a lot of eyeshadow palettes is because of this palette. It's so versatile. There's so much that you can do with this palette. There are so many combinations that you can make that I haven't felt the need to actually use anything else this year or actually buy any other eyeshadow palette this year, which is quite surprising because I have 40 of them right now. So yeah, in terms of color scheme, if you are a beginner and you kind of want a palette where every single color is inside of the palette, I would definitely recommend this one. But also in terms of the formula, even though these eyeshadows are definitely very pigmented, they are still very easy to work with, which is something that you come across very rarely. What I love about the formula is especially the mattes in here. You kind of put them in place and you can still blend them out to get a seamless blend, but they don't really go everywhere, you know. Sometimes you have too much color on your eye and then you start blending it out and you start here, for example, and your eyeshadow ends up here, which is a bit exaggerated, but that's kind of what I mean. So in terms of beginners, I think this is a really nice palette because you are getting used to more pigmentation, but you don't have to sacrifice the blendability for it, and you have a very versatile palette nonetheless. You also have a few highlighters in here. I don't really use them that much because I'm not really a powder highlighter gal, but they are also very nice eyeshadows. The shimmers in here are present. They're not the most impactful shimmer out there, but you still get a very opaque and really nice like shimmery element to every eye look that you do. If you are looking for a colorful eyeshadow palette, this is really beautiful, and it for me personally, it had everything that I wanted. So yeah guys, that concludes today's video. I hope you kind of enjoyed my 5 palettes that I would recommend for beginners in eyeshadow. I hope you kind of like the entire idea of like, this is a neutral palette, this is a mix, this is pastels, this is monochromatic, and this is full on color. So yeah, please let me know what your like beginner friendly eyeshadow palette would be, or what was the first eyeshadow palette that you actually owned. Please let me know in the comments. Give this video a like and like a thumbs up, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye!